This is Mansfield in the year 2000, a busy North Nottinghamshire market town with an industrial heritage. But these streets are steeped in history that predates the Industrial Revolution. Restored examples of early dwellings in the town may be found along an alleyway off Church Street, right here in the town centre, in White Lion Yard. The restored 18th century White Lion building forms one side of the yard, whilst on the other is Tudor House and the caves which are the home to the new visitor centre. Tudor House is one of the earliest surviving properties in the town, the roof timbers having been dated to 1584. It was built about 20 years after the town's grammar school was founded in the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. In the 1730s, the property on the other side of the yard was converted into a public house, the White Lion. When it was offered for sale in 1772, it was described as having convenient rooms, a large rock cellar, brewing vessels, and a good garden. The back gardens were at modern-day car park level. They were accessed by the stairway. The rock at the back of the yards was so soft that the houses could be extended by digging caves, known as rock cellars. Little is known about the origins of the properties in the yard, but we do know that the properties between the yard and the bottom of Church Street once belonged to the priests of Southwell Minster. Church Street was the town's most important shopping area, and Mansfield was now beginning to benefit from the Industrial Revolution. Tudor House became the home of a quarry owner and later a saddler's workshop. These pictures were taken just before Mansfield Brewery closed the White Lion in 1903. For some years it became a lodging house, but then the buildings on both sides of the yard fell into disuse and decay. Mansfield District Council's involvement began in 1995, following a substantial collapse of the sandstone rock face the previous year, possibly due to modifications made during the last war when the caves were used as air raid shelters. Serious damage was caused to some of the buildings, and the White Lion had to be shored up to make it safe and to prevent further collapses. Over the following years, Mansfield District Council acquired the properties and drew up plans for the appropriate restoration of the buildings. John Cunnington, a specialist architect on restorative projects, was selected as consultant. Because of the historical significance of Tudor House, a 16th century Grade II listed building, it was decided, wherever practical, to use materials and techniques similar to those of the original construction. The White Lion would be renovated using modern building techniques, but they would be blended with those of the late 18th century to create a building to reflect the era of its original construction. To be successful, the District Council had to establish a significant funding package. Financial support for the project came from the East Midlands Development Agency, Nottinghamshire County Council, European sources, and the Council's own funds. The yard was a sorry sight, unused and largely unknown to the local community. Bodil Construction, a Nottingham building company, was appointed as the main contractor. Their site agent, John Watkin, set about the work with enthusiasm, using experience gained on similar restoration projects. The first major task was to start the repair to the staircase from Tootil Car Park. Wooden shuttering was constructed against the rock face, and the staircase foundations were cast in concrete. Vibrating the wet concrete consolidated each step. The concrete was then smoothed over to provide an even surface. Next, a complex network of scaffolding, a forest of poles, was created, not only to provide access to the buildings at all levels, but also to support them until they were fully restored. Modern life in Mansfield and the narrow entry from Church Street meant that all materials had to be moved to and from street level by a small hoist incorporated into the scaffolding. This was accessed from Tootil Car Park, some 10 metres above street level. As the scaffold took shape, the staircase became impassable, and personal access to all levels was only possible by ladder. Walking through the fully restored yard, the most striking features of the buildings must be the walls, windows and doors. As with the whole project, these were renovated with great care and attention to detail, so as to nearly as possible reproduce their original appearance. These pictures from 1994 show the collapse of the White Lion at the end nearest the caves. It had a flat roof, although there is evidence to suggest that this had replaced an earlier pitched roof at some time. The walls are made of light sandstone, known as Mansfield white stone, probably obtained from a local quarry. The stone had been shaped into regular-sized pieces so it could be laid in courses rather like bricks in a modern building. Over many centuries, the weather had eroded the walls of Tudor House. It was, of course, more than 100 years older than the White Lion. This stone is much deeper in colour and is known as Mansfield red stone. It was laid to take account of its natural shape rather than in courses, so the finished wall has a more random appearance. Because of their different construction, the renovation of the two buildings needed different techniques. For clarity, first we'll see how the White Lion was restored to represent an 18th century building, and then we'll look at the different techniques used to restore the 16th century Tudor house. Although, of course, both buildings were restored simultaneously over the same period during 1998 to 2000. First then, the White Lion. The walls of the White Lion that remained standing were to be restored, but the collapsed walls would have to be rebuilt. Modern materials and methods were used for structural stability, whilst traditional materials and skills were retained on the external surfaces. While the inner skin of concrete blocks was being constructed, matching reclaimed Mansfield white stone was collected from Mansfield District Council's stone store. Each piece was selected and redressed using age-old methods. The mason appreciates how the stone was originally quarried and dressed, how and in which direction it will split when using his hammer and chisel. The finished stone was sorted into coarse sizes and taken down to the old brewery cave where it was stored until required. Laying natural coursed stone requires different skills to laying modern bricks or blocks. Each stone is different, perhaps slightly wider or deeper, and their length varies. They certainly don't sit squarely on the course beneath. The mason decides the height of the course and then pre-selects the stones to avoid aligning vertical joints, to match adjoining faces, and to make sure they fit precisely to the end of the course. A line and spirit level allow the first stone to be laid accurately. Lime mortar is used for building stone walls. Long before modern cement was invented, limestone was burned to create powder and mixed with water and sand to make mortar. At White Lion Yard, lime was soaked in water until it had formed a paste. It was then mixed with sand and white cement. Lime mortar is still used today because, unlike modern cement mortars, it's more pliable when wet, and it accommodates movement in the walls, first by flexing and then by cracking. This is far preferable to having the stone break, a much more difficult repair job. The joints are neatened with a small trowel. This process is called pointing. Final finish takes place some hours later, after the mortar has partially set. The rough mortar edges and the stone face are cleaned with a hard brush. A softer brush is finally used to smooth off the pointing. After only a few days, the join between the original and the newly built wall was difficult to see, clearly demonstrating the skill of the masons. Why not look for the join next time you pass through the yard? Above the windows and doors, the outside walls are supported by stone lintels. Inside the building, the original wooden lintels had rotted away. The walls were temporarily supported while the old lintels were removed and replaced by modern concrete units. For the new part of the White Lion, new lintels had been cut from local stone. Some of the original lintels needed cosmetic repair. Here, the mason is cutting a small piece of stone to repair a damaged lintel.
So I've bedded it, and then I can fill this in with stone dust.
What, stone dust?
Stone dust, a bit of stone dust, sand, just to match the colour on this. So I'm not showing the aggregate like we have done on the pointing. And then it'll tone down better then.
When it dried, the repair was almost invisible. This is as it can be seen today. The flat roof of the White Lion had to be removed prior to the construction of the new one. The inner concrete block walls were built to an apex to support the ridge beam. It required a huge crane to lift the steel joist. Gradually, and with great care, it was moved into position. Spanning from end to end, it was much longer and lighter than would have been possible using a wooden beam. The use of modern lightweight rafters maximised the space inside the building, allowing an additional floor in what would otherwise have been the roof space. The roof was insulated to modern standards and window lights fitted, but its completion had to wait until the masons had laid the stone facing to the walls. The doors and window frames in both buildings were in an advanced state of decay. Work commenced on their replacement. Each frame was carefully measured so that it could be reproduced as nearly as possible to the original.
I shall make these frames in exactly the same way that these were made, that is drawboard joints. They are made, drill holes through the major part of the frame, insert the tenon, mark where the hole is, and drill the hole in the tenon slightly offset. And you hammer a new dowel straight through and it pulls them together.
We'll see the completed joint in the finished frame in a moment, but first let's look at a frame being assembled. The wood mouldings, the basis of the frames, were made by machine. The mouldings were then handcrafted to form the windows and doors you see today. The window being made is unusual in that it opens by sliding horizontally. This is known as a Yorkshire sash window.
And this is the finished window, and that is the completed drawbar joint I mentioned earlier.
Woodworking skills are by no means lost, judging by the craftsmanship of Chris Hill, the carpenter at work here. Meanwhile, part of the rock face at the rear of the White Lion had been found to be unsafe. Two small holes in the rock revealed another cave that was accessed from the rear of the ironmongers on Church Street. The cave had been used for storage, and a safe and a cupboard had even been cut into the rock. At the far end, the two small holes could be seen that opened into the area at the rear of the White Lion. The cave was thoroughly surveyed and photographed prior to filling it with concrete, right up to the roof. A most unusual operation involving a system of venting pipes to prevent air pockets as the concrete was pumped in.
It's quite an interesting project, this.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think we'll do another one of these, do you?
Oh no, no.
I don't think I will.
This wall now faces you as you enter the restaurant. After receiving a coat of wood priming paint, the windows were manoeuvred into position and fitted into the openings in the restored walls.
Yeah, do you want to take the light towards back at cave and I'll see if we can get a reading at the back? There. How much? 150.
New floor levels were established for the caves and for the yard to allow trenches to be dug which would accommodate modern electricity cables, gas pipes, drains and other services. Now the building stone had been used, the floor of the old brewery cave was dug out in preparation for a reinforced concrete floor. A damp-proof membrane was laid to prevent moisture passing up through the concrete. Around the edge of the cave, a trough was incorporated for indirect lighting, heating and other services.
I've been to speak to Nico. Oh yeah, that'd be fine.
To eliminate the possibility of further roof collapses, holes were drilled vertically into the rock ceiling. Steel reinforcing bars were pushed up and secured to the rock with resin. Buildings in Mansfield of a similar age to the White Lion often had slate tiles on their roofs, so a supply was obtained and specialist tilers set about dressing them to fit onto the new roof. The prepared slates were carried to the roof and laid one by one. Each slate had a hole punched through and they were fixed to the wooden laths with copper nails. The work around the window lights was very intricate. Sheet lead was cut and shaped to just the right contours to ensure the roof didn't leak. The slates were then cut and laid over the lead flashing to create the finished roof. Work also progressed on the extension that would form the covered area from the White Lion to the old brewery cave at the rear. The floors of the smaller caves that now form the visitor centre were reinforced, damp-proofed and concreted. The ceilings were drilled to prevent collapses. High-level access to the White Lion was formed by creating a walkway from car park level to a door on the first floor. Before we see the finishing work on the White Lion and on the yard, we'll look at how the restoration of Tudor House was achieved using totally different techniques, starting with the roof. The first task was to remove the clay tiles, called pan tiles, because of the method of manufacture. The origin of the tiles and their date of manufacture are unknown, but the style is thought to have originated in Holland. It is possible they were brought to the east coast as ballast on ships that may otherwise have been unstable without a cargo of sufficient weight. Later they were made in this country too. The roof had last been repaired in 1977, when a membrane and new laths were fitted. It was also decided at that time to provide additional support to the ageing roof timbers. In the 16th century there was no machinery to help with the manufacture of roof beams, so they were very difficult to make. Roof design was determined very much by the availability of suitable timber, and so the beams tended to be much stronger than needed to support the roof, which is why the original roof timbers at Tudor House continue in use today, even though the passage of the centuries has diminished much of their strength. It was the original wooden roof beams that were dated to 1584. A modern membrane and new laths were fitted to the roof prior to fixing the original pan tiles. Notice that the tiles simply interlock into place and are not held on the roof with nails.
It's not every day you can use these old handmade tiles, clay tiles, and usually you're sort of using uniformed slates and other materials. And now back to basics here. These are more work involved in these. It's, well, the new materials are made to go on quicker and everything fit easier. I mean, none of these are square or anything, so you have to sort of juggle them about, sort of try and make them fit as best you can. So when they made these, they make them with the corners off. You have to knock the corners off, and they did them with an hammer rough cut. As you can see, the rough edge there, to make them fit and interlock with the fitting tile. Perfect. Perfect. Perfect.
The first 4 courses of flat tiles and the ridge construction were retained as these local architectural features overcome the tendency for the curves of the pan tiles to let wet at the upper and lower edges of the roof. Next, the doors and windows were fitted. Whilst the replacement frames are Georgian, of a style dating from the 18th century, when the property was built in the late 1500s, the windows would have been divided by central mullions, without glass, but with internal wooden shutters. it was possible to restore most of the exterior walls of Tudor House by pointing between the stones with lime mortar. But in many cases, the stones had eroded away to such a degree that they had to be completely replaced with matching Mansfield red stone. The chimney was in particularly poor condition. Although it wouldn't be used again, it was restored to maintain the image of a 16th century property. The internal walls and ceilings were the first to receive treatment once Tudor House had been secured from the elements. On some walls, the original straw and plaster construction could still be seen. The patterning or striations on the plaster are consistent with wall finishes of the 16th century. During the preparation for restoration, there was a very exciting discovery. Under the lime wash, painted patterns were found on the wall similar to those applied by travelling decorators in the 17th century. They were carefully photographed, and to prevent further deterioration, they were preserved under a modern distemper coating. The first coat of plaster was made from a mix of lime, white cement and sand. Then, with a real touch of history, animal hair was added. This gives the plaster greater strength, resilience, and helps prevent cracking. The first coat was applied using modern tools, although similar application techniques are likely to have been used originally. As it dried, the surface of the first coat was roughened to help the adhesion of the top coat. The top coat is a much finer mix of sand, lime and gypsum. Several test applications were made, and it was found that brushing the surface while it was still wet created striations similar to those on 16th century walls. One of the moments filled with great anticipation was when a well was investigated by an archaeologist. It may once have provided fresh water for the local properties, or supplies for the brew house to the rear of the White Lion.
We hope to remove everything that's in there. There may be, it may be just stone and sand, but there may be bottles and things which could be related to the White Lion Inn at one time. We don't know. It's 50-50 whether there'll be anything of any historic interest underneath that modern material.
The material from the bottom was brought up, bucketful by bucketful, but sadly nothing of historic interest was found. It is now protected by a metal grid that can be seen at the base of the stairway that leads to the car park. One ceiling in Tudor House had partially collapsed due to the failure of a roof truss. This revealed clearly the original construction of reeds and plaster. It was decided to restore it, where possible, in its original form. Some of the timbers, or trusses, had to be replaced, but there was one that could be reused with a little support.
Here we're supporting this old truss. We've got a channel either side of it. We've got the two beams up, and now the idea is for us to drill the beams and put some long bolts through. When that's done, we can go for the other one, can't we? I need some coach screws for that one though, coach bolts.
The reeds for the ceiling were delivered and restoration began.
Okay, perfect. We're more or less doing it as we would envisage them to do it in the 16th century, which is basically to pack some timbers down, as we have done, thread the reeds through, as you can see we're doing at the moment, and when they're all in position we will permanently nail up the timbers.
None of the team had any experience of fitting a ceiling made from laths, reed and plaster, so it presented a real challenge. Progress was made by a process of trial and error. Initially, the reeds were fed above laths that had been nailed to the timber trusses. After only a short time, it was clear that this wasn't practical. It would have taken days to complete the ceiling. After much discussion, the reeds were sandwiched between two laths and offered to the joists. Then the upper lath was removed.
You got that? Yeah. Right, put that on there. Put that on there. Put that nail in. Just, it's in halfway.
Almost certainly, locally grown reeds would have been used in the original ceiling. Today, most commercially available reeds are imported, but after searching for some days, John found a supply of reeds grown in Norfolk.
Thickens that end. Just feed them in on the first two. Don't pull your laptop. Just shift them all across now.
Finally, it was found that fixing the laths to the ceiling joists at only one end and then pushing the reeds in from the free end was very effective.
Hold on. Right, it don't matter, we can fly over this one anyway. Just make sure they go past this joist.
Yeah.
Try it, I ain't gonna bother going right to that end. Just let them come this way.
A bit more, that's it.
Keep going.
That's it.
That's it.
The reeds were 25mm thick when the ceiling was finished.
All the way.
Then came the plastering. It was not as straightforward as on a 21st century ceiling. The reeds offered an uneven and flexible surface to which the plaster often refused to stick.
There we go.
Patience, skill and persistence eventually won the day. It was with some relief that the striations were finally applied to the finished ceiling. Both floors of the upper storey of Tudor House were near to collapse. The original floors had a concrete-like surface made from a mix of lime, stone debris and wood ash, known as a lime ash floor. The mix had been laid onto wooden laths that had been nailed to the floor joists. The laths and joists had almost rotted away, and as they were removed, somewhat surprisingly, between the joists there was a mixture of leather clippings and grain. Perhaps this had been put there for insulation. Their removal caused quite a bother. The leather clippings have been confirmed as remnants from shoemaking or repair. The most significant find was the insole of a shoe, thought to date from around 1830 to 1850. There were 4 cobblers working on Church Street during that period, perhaps confirming the use of Tudor House by a saddler or a cobbler at that time. As the work progressed, samples were collected for display in the visitor centre. The floor joists had to be renewed or reinforced prior to laying the new floor.
I'm going to explain to you the process that we've used to split up the cleft oak laths that are going to be used under the lime ash floors. Start off with an oak tree which is about 2 feet in diameter, and using wedges you split it up into 8ths or 16ths. You then saw it to the required length, and the process from there is splitting up these segments of the oak tree into laths using a froe, which is this tool here. This is probably a froe which is about 100 years old. You place the froe on top of the piece of wood that you want to split, and you then hammer it in with a mallet into the end. This piece has already been split part of the way down, and by a process of wiggling the froe backwards and forwards and bending the wood in a break, you can get the split to run all the way down and control the direction of the split to some extent as you're splitting. When the individual laths have been split up using the froe, the next thing you do is you lay them in a bundle, and you lay them carefully in the bundles so that the flow of each individual lath is the same as the lath that fits next to it. This means that when you take them out of the bundle and lay them on the floor, although they're not straight, if you select them carefully, you can get quite a tight fit with the laths.
Immediately comes to my mind is I would like to see a line designed for that. What you've got to do is your absolute minimum cutting.
Yeah.
Nine test floor mixes were made using brick debris, wood ash, lime, gravel and plaster. The mix chosen most closely resembled the original lime ash floor. The materials had to be gathered together for the new floors. Old bricks were crushed to form aggregate. Wood was burned to form ash. The mixture was made up from the chosen recipe, displayed in the traditional fashion. Almost everything on the restoration project had to be carried manually to the work location, and the floor materials were no exception.
One plastic. Who? Colin, I think, or my door stuck.
The mixing was initially done by hand, but there was some 20th century assistance. In a faithful copy of the original, hay was spread over the laths to help bond the lime ash mix to the wood to give additional strength and, last but not least, to prevent the mix from falling through to the roof beneath.
Coming on quite well actually. Has this been laid this morning? Yeah, we're on just on with it now, yes. It's, that was obviously the first area we did near the radiator. We've got this retardant, which without that we would have been in big trouble. But it's mixing up quite well. Did you see the mix? In fact, I did, yeah. You see it that day, yeah. So, quite pleased with it really. It's coming on nicely.
The second floor was completed using the same techniques. It was now possible to remove most of the scaffolding. When the unsupported walls of Tudor House and the White Lion were exposed for the first time, an 18th century yard was revealed. To allow easier access, work began to reduce the ground level at the edge of the car park. These excavations were also essential to allow the cave roofs to be reinforced with concrete and to prevent water dripping from the ceilings of the caves.
That's it.
A new footpath was created which would also allow wheelchair access to the upper floors of the White Lion. When the area at the rear of Tudor House was being cleared, a fireplace was discovered facing out. There was also the discovery of an old wall.
This is one of the bricks we've taken out of the wall, which is definitely a handmade brick, and it seems to be all clay, as you can see.
Then a stone floor was uncovered. The flagstones fit so perfectly together that the men took time out to discuss how these stones could have been made with such precision so many years ago.
You know, a good mason, he could get that finish virtually with a tool. And also what they used to do, they used to fire their own drags and drag it. Do you know that tungsten drag I've got? And it combs, they call them. Yeah. And they used to, and a blacksmith used to make all the tools then. And then they used to do the combs for them, and then they'd just comb it over to get finished like that. And then different stones they'd use, even in them days, they used a harder stone to rub it. Yeah. And that's how they used to get it finished like that. Actually, they used to do it as good then as what we can do with machines.
Early records confirm that there had been another room at the rear of Tudor House, perhaps a kitchen, and plans were drawn up for this to be included in the restoration. The masons clad the new room in matching stone. Then began one of the most difficult tasks. The alleyway from the yard to Church Street was too narrow to allow wheelchair access. It was to be widened, which meant supporting the upper stories of 17 Church Street while the old walls were removed and new ones constructed. The china basket had to be temporarily relocated while the work took place. Access to this historic part of Mansfield would ultimately be available for all. Meanwhile, finishing work was well underway. Some of the walls in Tudor House were prepared for wooden panelling. Stone paving slabs were stored in the ground floor of the White Lion until they were laid, forming the floors of the caves. stone flags were also laid in the yard. The subdued lighting was fitted in the caves, moodily illuminating the rough, hewn rock faces of the walls. The wooden panelling was fitted in Tudor house, and decorating the rooms provided the finishing touch. The upper rooms of the White Lion were painted, carpeted and made ready for occupation. The new entrance foyer to the White Lion was prepared for opening. The footpaths and flower beds at the rear were completed. Wrought iron was added to provide security. Modern public lighting is a concession to the 21st century. Over a period of some 2 years, a derelict and unused part of the town centre has been converted into a replica 18th century yard. Let's for a moment reflect on the transformation. The people of the town may now park and make their way through history to the town centre. The caves at the rear of Tudor House have formed a visitor centre, where interactive displays encourage people to learn about the history of the town and the restoration of White Lion Yard. During most popular visiting times, members of the Old Mansfield Society give freely of their time to answer any questions visitors may have about the town's history.
It's a nice centrepiece,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
it does.
Yeah, yeah. Of course, the old railway station, and this is the Rock Valley where Mansfield Metal Box.
Yes, I've worked there.
Bastard Mills. Have you?
Yes.
New
Really?
facilities have been created for the public in these historic surroundings. The visitor centre provides a focal point for tourists and a place of local interest for schools. The efforts of the staff of Mansfield District Council, along with the support of their sponsors and the skill of local people, has created a quiet corner full of history away from the bustle of the town centre, of which the residents of Mansfield can be justifiably proud.